The basement of the Virginia Historical Society smelled like old paper and chemical preservatives, a scent that Dr. Caroline Marsh had grown to love over her 15 years as a photo restoration specialist. The November rain hammered against the small windows near the ceiling, creating a rhythm that helped her focus on the delicate work before her. She adjusted the magnifying lamp over the daguerreotype that had arrived that morning, part of an estate sale from a condemned building in Richmond's Church Hill neighborhood. The photograph showed a family of 5 standing rigid before a draped backdrop. The father stood behind a seated woman, presumably his wife, with 3 boys arranged by height. The image, dated 1861 based on the clothing and photographic technique, bore the water damage and chemical deterioration typical of pieces that had survived a century and a half in less than ideal conditions. What caught Caroline's attention immediately was an anomaly in the youngest boy's face. While the other family members stared directly at the camera with the frozen solemnity common to early photography, where subjects had to remain perfectly still for extended exposure times, the youngest son's features were blurred, suggesting movement at the crucial moment. Caroline had seen this before. A blink, a breath, a slight turn of the head could ruin a portrait in those days. What made this unusual was the deliberate nature of it. The boy appeared to have moved his head sharply to the left, towards something outside the frame, at the exact moment the exposure was being captured. His eyes, though blurred, seemed wide with what Caroline could only describe as fear. She reached for her notebook and began documenting the piece. The back of the daguerreotype case bore an inscription in faded ink that read, "The Carver Family, April 1861, Richmond," and below that, in different handwriting and what appeared to be much newer ink, someone had written, "Find the boy, he knows." Caroline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. She photographed the inscription with her phone and began searching the Historical Society's digital archives for any reference to the Carver family of Richmond. The search returned nothing. She expanded her parameters to include census records, property deeds, and cemetery registries for the Richmond area in the mid-19th century. Still nothing. This wasn't entirely unusual. Record-keeping during the Civil War era was often incomplete, and many documents had been destroyed when Richmond burned in April 1865. But for a family prosperous enough to afford a daguerreotype, there should have been some paper trail. She noted the date again, April 1861. That was the month Virginia seceded from the Union, the month the Civil War truly began in earnest. Caroline decided to focus on the photograph itself. Using specialized software, she began the process of digital restoration, carefully removing the water stains and chemical damage, pixel by pixel. As the image cleared, details emerged. The father's hand rested on what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger on the small table beside him. The mother's dress was expensive, suggesting wealth. The older boys, perhaps 14 and 12, wore matching suits with brass buttons, but it was the youngest, the one who had moved, who drew Caroline's attention again and again. As she enhanced the image, she could see that his mouth was open, as if he'd been trying to say something or perhaps scream. The direction of his gaze, now clearer, was definitely toward the left side of the frame, and in his blurred hand she could just make out what looked like a piece of paper or photograph clutched tightly. Caroline worked through lunch, her coffee going cold beside her as she lost herself in the restoration process. By 3 in the afternoon, she had a significantly clearer image. She printed a high-resolution copy and pinned it to her corkboard alongside her notes. That's when she noticed something that made her stomach turn. In the deep shadows behind the family, barely visible even in the enhanced image, there appeared to be a 6th figure. The form was so faint she couldn't be sure it wasn't a trick of light and shadow, but the more she stared at it, the more certain she became that someone else had been in that room, standing in the darkness, watching. She grabbed her phone and called Marcus Webb, a colleague who specialized in Civil War history and taught at Virginia Commonwealth University. They'd collaborated on several projects over the years, and if anyone could help her identify this family, it would be Marcus. He answered on the third ring, his voice warm and slightly distracted. "Caroline, what's up? I'm in the middle of grading papers that are making me question my career choices. I need your help with something strange," she said, staring at the photograph. "I've got a daguerreotype from 1861, Richmond, family named Carver. Ring any bells?" There was a pause. "Carver? No, can't say it does. Why?" "Because they don't exist. No census records, no property deeds, nothing. But they were clearly wealthy enough to afford a professional photograph. Send me what you've got. I'll dig around." Caroline emailed him the images and her notes, then returned to examining the photograph. She decided to focus on the ledger under the father's hand. Enhancing that portion of the image, she could just make out what appeared to be columns of numbers and names. The handwriting was too small and blurred to read clearly, but it was definitely a record book of some kind. Her phone buzzed. Marcus had replied faster than she'd expected. "Call me, now." She dialed immediately. That was quick. "Caroline, where did you get this photograph?" His voice had lost all its earlier warmth. He sounded shaken. "Estate sale from a condemned building in Church Hill. Why? What did you find?" "I didn't find the Carvers in any official records, but I found references to them in some letters and diaries that never made it into the mainstream historical archives. Private collections, things donated by families decades after the war. Caroline, the Carvers weren't just wealthy. They were involved in something that several witnesses at the time described as an abomination against God and nature. Those are direct quotes from 3 different sources." Caroline felt her mouth go dry. "What kind of abomination?" "That's where it gets murky. The references are vague, deliberately so, but they all mention disappearances. People who went into the Carver house and never came out. Enslaved people primarily, but also poor whites who got on the wrong side of the family. There were whispers about medical experiments, about the father, Daniel Carver, being obsessed with what he called the science of preservation." Preservation. That's all I've got so far. But Caroline, every source I found mentioned the youngest son. They called him the Witness. There's one diary entry from a Union soldier who was part of the occupation of Richmond in 1865. He wrote about searching the Carver property and finding, and I quote, "evidence of horrors that would make Satan himself weep." But he never specified what those horrors were, and by all accounts, the property was burned shortly after, orders supposedly coming from the highest levels of military command. Caroline looked at the photograph again, at the boy's blurred face, his open mouth, his terrified eyes. "Marcus, I think he was trying to tell someone. I think he moved deliberately to ruin the portrait, maybe to draw attention to whatever was happening in that house." "There's more," Marcus said, his voice dropping. "I found a newspaper clipping from 1865, just a small item in the Richmond Whig. It mentions that the youngest Carver boy, Thomas, was the only member of the family to survive the war. It says he disappeared from a military hospital in Washington in September 1865. He was 12 years old. They never found him." The rain had intensified, and the basement suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Caroline found herself staring at that faint shape in the background of the photograph, at the figure standing in the darkness, watching the family pose for their portrait. "Caroline! You still there?" "Yeah, I'm here. Listen, I need to restore this image completely, see if I can pull any more details from it. Can you keep digging? I want to know everything about this family." "Already on it, But Caroline, be careful with this. I've got a bad feeling about it. Some things stay buried for a reason." After they hung up, Caroline returned to her workstation. She had several more hours of work ahead of her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden, something that people had died to keep secret. She thought about that inscription on the back of the case. "Find the boy. He knows." Someone, sometime in the last century and a half, had added that note. Someone who knew what Thomas Carver had witnessed. As she worked into the evening, the historical society emptying around her until she was alone in the basement, Caroline began to notice other details in the photograph. Scratches on the wall behind the family that looked less like damage and more like deliberate marks, possibly words. The way the mother's eyes, upon extreme magnification, seemed to glisten with what might have been tears. The fact that none of the family members were touching each other, maintaining careful distance even in the formal arrangement, and that figure in the shadows. The more she enhanced the image, the more certain she became that it was real, that someone had been standing there, just outside the range of the lamp's light that illuminated the family. She could almost make out the suggestion of a face, though it remained frustratingly unclear. It was nearly midnight when Caroline finally saved her work and prepared to leave. The rain had stopped, but the November wind rattled the windows. As she gathered her things, she glanced one more time at the printed photograph on her corkboard. In the dim light of the basement, with only her desk lamp illuminating the space, she could have sworn the shadow figure looked darker, more defined than it had hours ago. She told herself it was exhaustion, tricks of light and a mind worn down by too many hours of focused work. But as she climbed the stairs and locked the basement door behind her, Caroline couldn't shake the image of Thomas Carver's blurred face, his open mouth frozen in a silent scream that had echoed across 164 years, waiting for someone to finally hear it. Caroline didn't sleep well that night. She dreamed of daguerreotype portraits that moved like films, of figures emerging from shadows, of a young boy running through burning streets trying to escape something that pursued him just outside the frame of consciousness. When her alarm went off at 6, she was almost relieved to abandon the troubled sleep. She arrived at the Historical Society by 7:30, earlier than usual, driven by an urgency she couldn't quite explain. The basement felt different in the morning light that filtered weakly through the high windows. Less oppressive, more clinical. She made coffee in the small kitchenette and settled back at her workstation, pulling up the files from the previous night. In the clear light of morning, she could see the shadow figure in the photograph more clearly. It definitely wasn't a trick of light. Someone had been in that room, deliberately positioned in the darkness. She began working on that section of the image, applying filters and enhancement techniques to try to resolve the figure into something identifiable. Her phone rang at 9. Marcus again. "You're not going to believe what I found," he said without preamble. "I was at the Library of Virginia at 6 this morning, going through their restricted collections. They have a box of materials that were sealed by court order in 1867, only opened for research purposes in 1967, and then immediately re-restricted. I had to get special permission to access it." What was in it? Testimony from a military tribunal. Caroline, Daniel Carver was arrested in January 1865 when Union forces took Richmond. He was charged with crimes against humanity. The testimony is horrifying. He'd been running what the documents call a preservation facility in his basement. He was obsessed with the idea of preserving people, of stopping death through chemical processes. He'd been experimenting on enslaved people he'd purchased specifically for this purpose, as well as anyone else he could get his hands on. Poor whites who wouldn't be missed. Deserters from both armies. Prisoners. Caroline felt sick. The science of preservation. Exactly. The testimonies describe a basement laboratory filled with tanks and jars, with bodies in various states of preservation. Some were still alive when they were discovered, but barely. The procedures he'd subjected them to were described as torture beyond imagination. And Caroline, Thomas Carver, was the one who led Union soldiers to the house. He'd escaped somehow, made it to Union lines, and he told them everything. What happened to Daniel Carver? That's where it gets strange. He was convicted, sentenced to death by hanging, but he never made it to the gallows. According to the records, he died in his cell the night before his execution. The cause of death was listed as sudden apoplexy, but there were notes in the margins suggesting something else. One guard reported that Carver had been smiling when they found him, and that his body showed signs of having undergone some kind of chemical treatment, like he'd somehow managed to dose himself with something. Caroline was staring at the photograph, at Daniel Carver's stern face, at his hand resting proprietarily on that ledger. "Marcus, I think that book he's holding in the photo might be his records, his documentation of the experiments. If that's true, and if that ledger still exists somewhere, it could be one of the most significant and horrifying historical documents related to the Civil War era. But Caroline, that's not even the strangest part. I found a deposition from a Union surgeon who examined Thomas Carver when he first arrived at their camp. The surgeon noted that the boy had chemical burns on his arms and torso, that he appeared to have been subjected to the same procedures his father was performing on others, and he wrote something else that made my blood run cold. He said Thomas told him that his father had succeeded, that the preservation worked, but that the cost was too terrible to bear. What does that mean? I don't know. The surgeon seemed to think the boy was traumatized, that he was speaking in riddles. But what if he wasn't? What if Daniel Carver actually achieved something? Caroline pulled up the enhanced image of the shadow figure. "Marcus, there's someone else in this photograph. Someone standing in the darkness behind the family. I'm working on resolving the image now. Caroline, listen to me carefully. I think you should stop. I've been reading these documents all morning, and there are warnings throughout them. Multiple people involved in the case, including the Judge Advocate General who prosecuted Carver, experienced what they described as nightmares and visions after being exposed to evidence from the house. One officer committed suicide. The official recommendation was that all physical evidence be destroyed and the property burned to the ground. Whatever Daniel Carver was doing, it affected people psychologically. These documents themselves were sealed because they were deemed dangerous to public peace and sanity. You don't seriously believe that a photograph could be dangerous? I believe that sometimes, when we look into the past, especially into dark corners of it, we bring something back with us. I believe that trauma and horror can leave an impression on objects, on places, on images. Maybe it's psychological, maybe it's something else. But I'm asking you as a friend, as someone who cares about you, to consider walking away from this." Caroline looked at the photograph, at Thomas Carver's blurred face, and felt something she couldn't quite name. A responsibility, perhaps, a sense that someone needed to bear witness to what had happened, to give voice to the voiceless. "I can't, Marcus. That boy tried to tell someone. He ruined the portrait deliberately, to leave a record of what was happening. If I walk away now, if I let this get buried again, then his courage meant nothing." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Okay, I understand. But promise me something. Don't work on this alone. I'm coming over there. Give me an hour." They hung up, and Caroline returned to her enhancement work. She applied a combination of techniques, using multiple software programs, slowly coaxing detail from the shadows. It was painstaking work, requiring patience and a steady hand, but gradually the figure began to resolve. It was a woman, She stood perfectly still, unlike the family, her face pale and expressionless. Her dress was plain, marking her as either a servant or an enslaved person, but it was her eyes that made Caroline's breath catch. Even in the enhancement, even with the limitations of the original daguerreotype, those eyes were wrong. They reflected the light in a way that eyes shouldn't, bright and metallic, like mirrors. Caroline's hands were shaking as she printed the enhanced image. She pinned it beside the full photograph and stepped back to compare them. The woman in the shadows wasn't part of the family portrait. She hadn't been supposed to be there, or perhaps she had been, but not as a person, as an exhibit, as evidence of Daniel Carver's terrible success. The basement door opened upstairs, and Caroline heard footsteps descending. She glanced at her watch. Only 20 minutes had passed since her call with Marcus. Too soon for him to have arrived. "Hello?" she called out. "We're not open yet." The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. Caroline moved to the bottom of the stairs. Looking up, a figure stood at the top, silhouetted against the bright lights of the main floor. For a disorienting moment, she thought of the woman in the photograph, standing in shadows, watching with those strange, reflective eyes. "I'm sorry, but the Historical Society doesn't open until 10, Caroline said, her voice firmer than she felt. "You'll need to come back." The figure descended, and Caroline felt relief wash over her as the lights resolved the shape into a man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had the look of an attorney or academic, someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Marsh," he said, his voice cultured and precise. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Edmund Price. I'm representing the estate that sold you the daguerreotype yesterday, the Carver family photograph." Caroline felt a warning tingle at the base of her skull. "How did you know I was working on it?" "The Historical Society's acquisition records are public, Dr. Marsh. When I saw that you'd purchased the piece, I knew I needed to speak with you urgently." He reached the bottom of the stairs and extended his hand. His grip was cool and dry. "I'm here to buy it back from you. I'm prepared to offer triple what your institution paid for it. It's not for sale, and even if it were, I don't have the authority to sell it." Edmund Price smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you'll find I can be very persuasive. Dr. Marsh, that photograph is dangerous, not in a metaphorical sense, truly, actually dangerous. It should never have been sold. It was supposed to have been destroyed decades ago." "Why?" Caroline found herself moving back toward her workstation, toward the enhanced images she'd created. "Because some things should remain buried. Because the Carver family's crimes were so heinous that the decision was made at the highest levels to erase them from history. Not to hide them, you understand, but to prevent the spread of their poison. Daniel Carver documented his experiments obsessively. He created what he called a photographic record of his subjects, before and after treatment. That daguerreotype you're working on is one of dozens he created. Most were destroyed, but a few survived, hidden away by various parties over the years. Each one has brought nothing but tragedy to those who possessed it." "That's ridiculous. It's just a photograph." "Is it?" Price moved closer, and Caroline noticed for the first time that his eyes, like the woman's in the photograph, reflected light strangely. "Tell me, Dr. Marsh, have you been sleeping well, having unusual dreams, feeling watched when you're alone?" Caroline felt her stomach drop. She had felt all of those things, but she'd attributed them to stress, to the unsettling nature of what she was learning about the Carvers. "Who are you, really?" "I told you I represent the estate. I'm here to clean up loose ends, to ensure that the past remains in the past where it belongs. I'm offering you a chance to walk away cleanly, to forget you ever saw this photograph, to go back to your normal life. Take the money, use it for something good, restore other photographs, other histories that deserve to be told, but let this one go." "And if I refuse?" Price's smile faded. Then you'll find out why the Carver photograph is dangerous. You'll discover what Thomas Carver discovered, what drove him to disappear from that hospital in Washington. You'll learn that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Before Caroline could respond, the basement door opened again and Marcus's voice called down, "Caroline, you down there!" Price's expression shifted to something like regret. "Think about my offer, Dr. Marsh. You have until tomorrow. After that, I can't protect you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, placing it on her workstation. "Call me when you've made the right decision." He moved past her and climbed the stairs, nodding politely to Marcus as they passed each other. Marcus watched him go, then turned to Caroline with a puzzled expression. "Who was that?" "Trouble," Caroline said. She picked up the business card. It was blank except for a phone number embossed in gold. "He wants to buy the photograph back. He says it's dangerous." Marcus came down the stairs and looked at the enhanced images on Caroline's corkboard. His face went pale when he saw the image of the woman in the shadows. "Jesus Christ, Caroline, those eyes!" "I know. Marcus, what if he's right? What if there's something about this photograph that's genuinely harmful? Then that's exactly why we need to understand it. If Daniel Carver created something that could hurt people, even through images, then it needs to be documented, studied, and safeguarded. We can't just let it disappear." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But we also need to be smart about this. If this Price character represents some kind of organization that's been covering up the Carver case for over a century, then we're dealing with people who have resources and a willingness to use them." Caroline nodded slowly. "I need to finish the restoration. I need to see what else is in this photograph, but I also think we need backup. We need to document everything we've found and make sure it's not just sitting in my head or yours." "Agreed. I'll write up a summary of the historical records and post it to a secure server. You document the restoration process, every step. We make sure that if something happens to us or the photograph, the information survives." They worked through the rest of the morning, Caroline continuing the painstaking restoration, while Marcus typed up his findings on his laptop. By noon, Caroline had enhanced the image as much as she could with her current software. The photograph was remarkably clear now, details visible that had been hidden for more than a century and a half. She could read the scratches on the wall now. They formed words, crude and desperate, "Help us," carved into the plaster behind where the family stood. She could see that the mother's dress had dark stains on the hem, stains that looked suspiciously like blood. She could make out more of the ledger under Daniel Carver's hand, and the entries she could partially read were chilling. Names followed by dates, followed by the notation "preserved" or "failed," and she could see Thomas Carver's hand more clearly, the piece of paper he clutched. It was a photograph, a daguerreotype, held in his small fist, of something Caroline couldn't quite make out, but that filled her with instinctive dread. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think I know why he moved. I think he was trying to show someone this other photograph he was holding. He was trying to provide evidence." Marcus came to stand beside her, looking at the screen. "Can you enhance what's in the photograph he's holding?" "I can try, but we're reaching the limits of resolution. The original image quality can only give us so much." She worked for another hour, isolating the small rectangle of the photograph within the photograph, applying every technique she knew to clarify it. What emerged made them both fall silent. The image showed a basement room, lined with what appeared to be large glass tanks or cylinders. In each one was a dark shape, roughly human in form, and standing in the center of the room, looking directly at the camera, was Daniel Carver, his expression one of triumph. "He documented it," Marcus whispered. "He photographed his own crimes, and Thomas stole the photograph. He was holding the evidence of what his father had done, That's why he ruined the portrait, to draw attention to it, to make sure someone would look closely, would see what he was holding. Then where is it now? Where's the photograph he was holding? That was the question, Caroline realized, that had driven everything. Someone at some point in the last 164 years had written on the back of the case, "Find the boy, he knows." Not he knew, past tense. He knows, present tense. As if Thomas Carver were still out there somewhere, still holding his terrible secret, still waiting for someone to understand what he'd been trying to tell them. The implication was impossible, absurd. Thomas Carver would have died long ago, if not in 1865, then certainly decades past. But Caroline found herself thinking about what Marcus had told her, about Daniel Carver's obsession with preservation, about the Union surgeon's note that the preservation worked, but the cost was too terrible to bear. Marcus, what if Daniel Carver succeeded, not in preserving corpses, but in actually preventing death? That's impossible. People age, Caroline. Even if he'd somehow developed a method to halt cellular decay, Thomas would still be 176 years old. No human could survive that long. Unless the cost the surgeon mentioned was humanity itself. Unless whatever Daniel Carver did removed something essential, turned people into something that wasn't quite alive, but wasn't dead either. They looked at each other, both recognizing the absurdity of what they were suggesting, while also feeling the cold certainty that they might be right. And if they were, if Thomas Carver had survived for over a century and a half, trapped in whatever state his father's experiments had left him, then he was still out there, still holding that photograph, still trying to tell someone what had happened in the basement of the Carver house in Richmond, Virginia, in the spring of 1861. "We need to find where the Carver house stood," Caroline said. "If there's any chance that photograph still exists, that's where it would be." Marcus nodded slowly. "I can get the property records. But Caroline, if we do this, if we keep pursuing this, we're making a choice. Edmund Price gave you a warning. Whoever he works for won't be happy if we ignore it." Caroline looked at the enhanced photograph of Thomas Carver, at his blurred face, frozen in a scream that had lasted more than a century. "I know, but I don't think we have a choice anymore. I think we've already gone too far to turn back." The Carver property had been located on the outskirts of what was then Richmond, an area that had been gradually absorbed into the city as it expanded over the decades. According to the property records Marcus uncovered, the house had been burned in April 1865, and the land had remained vacant for nearly 40 years before being sold to a textile manufacturer who built a factory on the site. That factory had operated until the 1960s, when it closed and sat abandoned for another 30 years before being torn down. The current property, according to city records, was a storage facility owned by a company called Preservation Holdings, LLC. "That can't be a coincidence," Marcus said as they sat in his car outside the chain-link fence surrounding the facility. It was late afternoon, the November sun already beginning its descent, painting the industrial landscape in shades of amber and rust. A company called Preservation Holdings owns the land where Daniel Carver conducted his preservation experiments. "It's not subtle," Caroline agreed. She clutched the folder containing her documentation of the photograph, along with printouts of Marcus's historical findings. They'd made multiple copies, distributed to trusted colleagues with instructions to make the information public if anything happened to them. It felt paranoid, but after the visit from Edmund Price, paranoia seemed like simple prudence. "What do you think is in there?" The storage facility consisted of a squat concrete building surrounded by rows of metal storage units. A sign near the gate advertised climate-controlled storage and 24-hour security. There were no other cars in the parking lot, no signs of activity. Only one way to find out. Marcus reached into the back seat and pulled out a gym bag. I brought bolt cutters, flashlights, and a pry bar, just in case. You're aware that this is breaking and entering, right? You're a college professor. You could lose your job. And you're a respected photo restoration expert, but we're both in too deep now. He opened his door. Come on, let's do this before I remember all the reasons this is a terrible idea. The chain-link fence wasn't particularly secure. The gate had a padlock, but the fence itself was old, with gaps large enough to squeeze through if you didn't mind scraping yourself. They made it inside without incident and approached the main building. The door was locked, but the windows were old and poorly maintained. Marcus used the pry bar to jimmy one open, and they climbed inside. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the fading daylight through grimy windows. It appeared to be a standard office space, abandoned and dusty. Old desks, filing cabinets, scattered papers. Marcus switched on his flashlight, and Caroline did the same. "What exactly are we looking for?" Marcus whispered. "I don't know. Anything that suggests this property has significance beyond being a storage facility. Anything that connects to the Carvers." They searched the office space methodically, finding nothing but the detritus of a long-closed business. It was Caroline who noticed the door at the back of the office, partially hidden behind a fallen filing cabinet. She moved the cabinet aside and tried the handle. Locked. "Here," Marcus said, handing her the pry bar. Together, they forced the door open. Behind it was a staircase leading down into darkness. "Of course there's a basement," Caroline muttered. She shone her flashlight down the stairs. The beam disappeared into darkness that seemed thicker than it should, almost tangible. "Why is there always a basement?" "Because that's where people hide things they don't want found," Marcus said. He didn't sound like he was joking. They descended slowly, their flashlights creating wild, swinging shadows. The stairs were concrete, relatively new, but they led down much farther than a normal basement would. Caroline counted steps, 20, 30, 40. They were going deep underground, deeper than any legitimate storage facility would need to go. At the bottom, they found themselves in a corridor. The walls were brick, old brick, that Caroline recognized as being consistent with mid-19th century construction. This wasn't part of the later buildings. This was original to the site. "They didn't burn everything," she said quietly. "The basement survived." The corridor led to a series of rooms. Most were empty, though they showed signs of having been used recently. Electric lights had been installed, though they weren't currently on. Newer concrete had been poured in places, reinforcing the old brick. Someone had been maintaining this space, keeping it intact. They found the first body in the third room. Caroline's scream echoed off the brick walls. Marcus grabbed her arm, his own flashlight shaking as he focused it on the corner of the room. It wasn't a body, she realized after a moment of pure terror. It was a photograph of a body, a large format print mounted on the wall, showing a person standing in what appeared to be this very corridor. The person's face was pale, their eyes reflecting the camera flash in that same wrong way she'd seen in the photograph of the woman behind the Carver family. "Christ," Marcus breathed. "It's recent. Look at the date stamp." Caroline forced herself to look. The bottom right corner of the photograph showed a date, November 2023. Last year, she turned away, her heart hammering, and that's when she saw the door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this one was metal, modern, with an electronic keypad lock. "Marcus, look." They approached the door carefully. The keypad showed a green light indicating it was unlocked. Caroline reached for the handle, then paused. "Maybe we should call the police," she said. "And tell them what? That we broke into a storage facility because we think it's connected to Civil War-era crimes? That we're looking for a boy who should have died 150 years ago?" Marcus shook his head. "We need evidence first. Real evidence. Then we call the police. Caroline knew he was right, but every instinct was screaming at her to run, to get out of this place while they still could. Instead, she pushed down the handle and opened the door. The room beyond was large, perhaps 30 feet square, and lit by electric lights that activated automatically when the door opened. For a moment, Caroline's brain refused to process what she was seeing. The walls were lined with glass cylinders, each about 6 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, filled with clear liquid. And suspended in each cylinder was a person. No, not people. Bodies, corpses, or at least things that looked like corpses but somehow weren't. Their eyes were open, reflecting the light like mirrors. Their skin was pale and waxy. They didn't move, didn't breathe that Caroline could see, but they also didn't look dead. They looked suspended, frozen, caught between states of being. "Oh, God," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, my God, he really did it. Daniel Carver really figured out how to preserve people." Caroline wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to be anywhere but in this room. But she forced herself to look, to count. There were 12 cylinders in total. 11 contained figures in various states of preservation. Some looked recent, their features still recognizably human. Others were older, their flesh starting to break down despite whatever chemicals kept them in stasis. But it was the 12th cylinder that made Caroline's blood run cold. It was empty, the liquid inside it disturbed, as if someone had recently climbed out. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now. We need to leave and call the police," and the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by their flashlights, Caroline heard something that made her soul try to leave her body. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps, coming from somewhere in the corridor behind them. "Caroline," Marcus whispered. "There's only one door out of this room." They stood frozen. Their flashlights pointed at the doorway. The footsteps grew closer, and then a figure appeared in the doorway. For a moment, illuminated by their beams, Caroline thought it was a child. Small, no more than 4.5 feet tall, dressed in clothes that might have been fashionable in the 19th century, but were now tattered and stained. Then the figure lifted its head, and Caroline saw its eyes, reflective, wrong, exactly like the eyes of the figures in the cylinders. And she recognized the face, even though it should have been impossible. She'd spent days studying that face, enhanced it, restored it, committed every line and curve to memory. Thomas Carver stood in the doorway, looking exactly as he had in 1861, except for those terrible eyes. His mouth opened, and when he spoke, his voice was thin and distant, like something heard through water. "You found me," he said. "Someone finally found me." Caroline's legs wouldn't work. She wanted to run, but her body refused to obey. Beside her, Marcus made a sound that might have been a prayer or a curse. "I've been waiting," Thomas continued. His movements were wrong, too fluid and too stiff at the same time, waiting for someone to see, to understand, to know what he did, what he made me become. "What?" Caroline had to swallow and try again. "What did he do to you?" Thomas stepped into the room, and Caroline saw that he was holding something, a daguerreotype case, old and worn. "He gave me his gift, the preservation. He tested it on the others first." He gestured vaguely at the cylinders. "But I was his son. He wanted me to be perfect. He wanted to prove his theory, that consciousness could survive indefinitely if the body was properly treated." "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. "How long have you been like this?" "Since March 1861. He perfected the process that month. I was his first true success." Thomas's face, that young boy's face, twisted into an expression of anguish that looked obscene on such innocent features. "Do you understand? I've been 12 years old for 164 years. I've been trapped in this body, in this state between life and death, for longer than anyone should ever exist. The hospital," Caroline said. "You disappeared from the hospital in Washington. They were going to study me. The union doctors could see that something was wrong, that I wasn't natural. So I ran. I've been running ever since, hiding, trying to find a way to die, but I can't. The preservation won't let me. It won't let any of them." He gestured at the cylinders again. "My father's legacy. Every few decades, someone finds his notes, his formulas. They try to replicate his work. They fail, mostly, create these poor things trapped like me, and I've tried to stop them, tried to destroy the records, but they always resurface." "Edmund Price," Caroline said. "He works for them, the people trying to replicate the preservation." Thomas nodded. "Price and others like him, they've been chasing my father's work for generations. They think it's the key to immortality, to conquering death. They don't understand that it's not life, it's not death. It's something between, something wrong. And we—" he looked at the cylinders. "We can't even scream." He held out the daguerreotype case to Caroline. "This is what I've been carrying. The evidence, the photographs my father took of his subjects before and after preservation, the documentation of his crimes. I tried to show people in 1861, tried to make them understand by holding it during the portrait. But no one looked closely enough. Not until you." Caroline took the case with trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth by decades of handling. She opened it and saw a series of daguerreotypes arranged in a small album. The images showed people in various stages of Daniel Carver's procedure, their faces captured in moments of agony and horror. The final image showed Thomas himself, lying on a table, his father standing over him with a syringe. "Make people understand," Thomas said. His voice was breaking, and Caroline realized with horror that there were tears on his face, tears that looked thick and wrong, like they were mixed with some kind of preservative. "Tell them what he did. Tell them what these people are still doing. Make them stop creating more of us. Please." "We will," Caroline promised, though her voice was shaking. "We'll expose everything. But Thomas, what about you? How do we help you?" Thomas smiled, and it was the saddest thing Caroline had ever seen. "You can't. I've tried everything, but you can help them." He pointed to the cylinders. "The police will find them now that you know. They'll shut this place down, and maybe someone will figure out how to let these people die properly. And you? I'll disappear again. I've gotten good at it over the years. I'll take these." He gestured to several other daguerreotype cases on a shelf that Caroline hadn't noticed before. "My father's complete documentation. I'll make sure it finds its way to the right people, historians who will understand its significance. And then I'll wait. Wait for science to catch up to Daniel Carver's terrible genius. Wait for someone to develop a way to undo what he did." "How do you survive?" Marcus asked. "How do you hide? The world is bigger than it used to be, easier to disappear in, and people see what they expect to see. A child alone raises concerns, but add the right story, the right circumstances, and I become invisible. I've been a dozen different people, worn a dozen different masks. I've learned to be whatever people need me to be, for however long I need to hide." His expression grew distant. "It's not living, but it's not dying either. It's just continuing." The sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor. Multiple sets this time, heavy and purposeful. Thomas's head snapped toward the sound, and his expression changed to one of fear. "They're here, Price's people. They must have known you'd come here." He looked at Caroline and Marcus with those terrible reflective eyes. "Run! Get out of here! Tell my story! That's all that matters now." "We can't leave you," Caroline started, but Thomas cut her off. "I've survived for 164 years. I'll survive whatever comes next, but the truth needs to survive too. Go, now." More lights came on in the corridor. Harsh fluorescent lights that banished the shadows. Caroline could hear voices now, men shouting orders, security or something worse. Marcus grabbed Caroline's arm. "He's right. We need to move." They ran. Caroline clutched the daguerreotype case to her chest as they sprinted back through the corridor, past those horrible photographs on the walls, past the rooms that had held God only knew what other horrors. Behind them she heard Thomas's voice, raised in a shout that echoed off the brick walls. "The truth matters! Tell them! The truth always matters!" They made it to the stairs and took them 3 at a time. Caroline's lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. Behind them she could hear pursuit, could hear Thomas's voice still echoing, now raised, in what might have been pain or defiance or something beyond either. They burst out of the office space and ran for the fence. The gap they'd come through seemed smaller now, harder to navigate, but they forced themselves through, tearing clothes and skin in their desperation. Marcus's car was where they'd left it, and he fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before finally getting the door open. They peeled out of the parking lot just as figures appeared at the fence behind them. Caroline looked back and saw them, 4 or 5 men in dark clothes, watching the car disappear into traffic. And standing behind them, barely visible in the gathering darkness, a small figure that might have been a child. They drove in silence for 10 minutes, putting as much distance between themselves and the storage facility as possible. Finally, Marcus pulled into a crowded shopping center parking lot and killed the engine. His hands were shaking. "What the hell did we just see?" he said. "Caroline, what the hell was that?" Caroline opened the daguerreotype case again. Looking at the images Thomas had carried for more than a century, the evidence of Daniel Carver's crimes. "The truth," she said quietly, "the real cost of trying to conquer death." She took out her phone and started taking photographs of the daguerreotypes, high-resolution images that captured every detail. Marcus watched her for a moment, then started doing the same with his own phone. "We need to upload these somewhere secure," he said. "Multiple locations. Make sure they can't be suppressed." Already on it. Caroline was creating a cloud storage account with a random email address, uploading the images as she took them. "I'm also sending copies to the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and every major historical society I can think of. Let's see them try to bury this when it's everywhere." As she worked, she thought about Thomas Carver's words. "Tell them what he did. Tell them what these people are still doing." This wasn't just about exposing historical crimes. It was about stopping current ones. Preservation Holdings LLC, Edmund Price, and whoever they worked for were continuing Daniel Carver's research, creating more victims, more people trapped in that horrible state between life and death. "We need to call the police," Marcus said. "Report what we saw in that basement. Those people in the cylinders, they might still be savable." "And tell them what? That we committed breaking and entering and found what looked like bodies but might not have been dead? That we met a boy who should have died in the 19th century? Caroline shook her head. "They'll think we're insane. We need more." "Then what do we do?" Caroline thought about it. "We do what Thomas asked. We tell the truth, but we tell it carefully. We start with the historical record, with the documentation of Daniel Carver's crimes during the Civil War. We present it as a historical discovery, an important piece of Civil War-era history that's been suppressed. We let people get outraged about that first. Then, once we have attention, once we have people listening, we start asking questions about Preservation Holdings LLC. We start connecting the dots publicly. That could take weeks, months even. What about the people in those cylinders? I'll make an anonymous call to the police, report suspicious activity at the facility, maybe a possible health code violation or something that will get them to investigate. They'll find those cylinders, and once they do, once it's a public crime scene, Price and his people won't be able to cover it up." Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, okay, that could work. But Caroline, we need to consider our own safety. These people have been covering this up for over a century. They have resources. They've probably killed to protect this secret. Which is why we make the information public before they can stop us. Safety in publicity. She finished uploading the last image and put her phone away. Let's go. We need to get back to your office, write this up properly, and start reaching out to media contacts. They drove to Virginia Commonwealth University. It was evening now, the campus mostly empty except for a few students hurrying between buildings. Marcus's office was in the history department, a cluttered space filled with books and papers and the detritus of an academic life. It felt safe, normal, a stark contrast to the horror they'd just escaped. Caroline sat at Marcus's computer while he made coffee. She began writing, starting with the historical record, presenting everything they'd discovered about Daniel Carver in clear, factual terms. She scanned the images from Thomas's daguerreotype collection, embedding them in the document. The pictures were horrifying, but they were also undeniable proof of what had happened. As she worked, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake. Return what you took and we'll forget this happened. Keep the evidence and you'll regret it." She showed it to Marcus, who'd come back with 2 mugs of coffee. "Price?" he said. "Or someone working with him. Let him try." Caroline blocked the number and returned to her writing, but her hands were shaking now, and she had to stop several times to steady herself. The adrenaline of their escape was wearing off, replaced by the full weight of what they'd discovered. They worked through the night, taking turns writing and researching, building a comprehensive document that laid out the entire history of the Carver case. By dawn, they had a 50-page report complete with scanned images, citations to historical sources, and careful documentation of every step of their investigation. Caroline sent it to a dozen major newspapers, to historical journals, to true crime podcasters and YouTube channels. She created a website and posted the entire thing there. She tweeted about it, posted on Facebook, sent it to every contact she had. Within hours it was spreading. The response was immediate and overwhelming. News organizations started calling. Other historians reached out, confirming details from their own research or adding new information. The story of Daniel Carver's crimes, hidden for over a century, was finally seeing the light, and with that attention came protection. By noon, Caroline and Marcus had given interviews to 3 major news networks. By evening, the story was national news. The Richmond police announced they were opening an investigation into Preservation Holdings LLC based on credible reports of illegal activity. 2 days later, the police raided the storage facility. They found the basement, the cylinders, the 11 figures suspended in preservation fluid. The news reports called them bodies, but Caroline knew better. She wondered if any of them could be saved, if modern medicine could undo what Daniel Carver's terrible science had done to them. Edmund Price disappeared. Preservation Holdings LLC turned out to be a shell company, layers of corporate structures leading to nothing. But the investigation was ongoing, and Caroline had faith that eventually the people behind it would be found. As for Thomas Carver, there was no sign of him. Caroline liked to imagine that he'd found somewhere safe to wait, that he was watching the news coverage with something like satisfaction, knowing that his testimony had finally been heard. She hoped that someday medical science would catch up to Daniel Carver's unnatural work, that they'd find a way to give Thomas the death he'd been seeking for so long. A week after the news broke, Caroline received a package at her office. There was no return address, but inside was a single photograph, a daguerreotype, old and precious, showing a young boy standing alone in an empty field. His face was clear, unblurred, and he was smiling. It was Thomas, looking as he must have looked before his father's experiments, before the preservation, before 164 years of undying existence. On the back, in careful handwriting that looked like it had been practiced for more than a century, was a single sentence: "Thank you for giving me a voice." Caroline framed the photograph and hung it in her office, where she could see it every day, a reminder of the boy who had tried to tell the truth so long ago, and of the responsibility everyone had to bear witness to history, no matter how dark or uncomfortable that history might be. The case of Daniel Carver became one of the most studied examples of Civil War-era crimes, a stark reminder of what happened when scientific curiosity divorced itself from ethics and humanity. Medical ethicists used it as a cautionary tale, historians debated the details, and slowly, painfully, society began to have necessary conversations about the limits of science, the nature of consciousness, and what it truly meant to be human. The 11 figures from the cylinders were eventually buried with dignity, though the question of whether they had been alive or dead when they were found remained a subject of debate. Caroline attended each funeral, feeling it was the least she could do for people who had suffered so long at the hands of Daniel Carver's heirs. She never heard from Thomas Carver again, though sometimes late at night when she was working alone in the basement of the Historical Society, she thought about him. A boy forever 12 years old, carrying the weight of 164 years, searching for peace that might never come. She hoped he'd found some measure of comfort in knowing that the truth had finally been told, that his suffering and the suffering of all those others had not been forgotten or erased. The truth mattered. That's what Thomas had shouted as she and Marcus ran from that terrible basement. The truth always mattered. And sometimes, Caroline thought, the truth was the only immortality worth seeking, not the preservation of flesh and bone, not the denial of death, but the survival of stories, of testimony, of voices that refused to be silenced. She returned her attention to her work, to the careful restoration of another photograph from another time. But she carried Thomas Carver's story with her, a reminder that every image she restored might contain secrets, might bear witness to truths that someone had tried to bury, and she would never stop looking, never stop listening, never stop giving voice to those who had been silenced. Because that was the real work of history, not just recording what happened, but ensuring that what happened was remembered, understood, and learned from. It was the work of bearing witness, of honoring those who had suffered, and of making sure that their suffering meant something. The photograph of Thomas as he once was, before his father's terrible gift, remained on her wall. A young boy with a genuine smile, frozen in a moment of innocence and hope. Caroline looked at it often, especially when the work grew hard or when the darkness of the past threatened to overwhelm her. And she thought about freedom, true freedom, not just physical liberty, but freedom from pain, freedom from suffering, freedom from the terrible weight of unwanted existence. Daniel Carver had sought to free humanity from death, but in doing so, he had created a prison worse than any grave. He had stolen from his victims the most basic right of any living thing, the right to end. That was the message, Caroline realized. That was what Thomas Carver's century-long testimony had been trying to tell them. That freedom wasn't the absence of death. Freedom was the right to live on your own terms and to die with dignity. It was the right to be heard, to be seen, to be treated as a human being with agency and worth. It was the right to rest when the struggle became too much. Daniel Carver and those who followed him had stolen that right from their victims. They had imposed existence without consent, had trapped consciousness in flesh that could no longer truly live, and in doing so, they had committed the ultimate violation, the ultimate act of tyranny. As Caroline prepared to leave her office that evening, she paused at the photograph one more time. "I hope you find peace, Thomas," she whispered. "I hope you find an end. You've earned it." The boy in the photograph smiled up at her, frozen forever in that moment of innocence. And Caroline, carrying the weight of his story with her, walked out into the evening air, grateful for the setting sun, grateful for the changing seasons, grateful for the natural cycle of life and death that gave meaning to existence. She had told the truth. She had given voice to the voiceless, and in doing so, she had learned the most important lesson history could teach, that every life mattered, every story deserved to be told, and that the freedom to be fully human, with all the joy and sorrow and inevitable end that entailed, was the most precious gift anyone could have. The case would continue to unfold for years to come. More victims would be discovered, more connections made, more people brought to justice. But the central truth would remain unchanged. Daniel Carver had tried to defeat death and had created something far worse in the process. And Thomas Carver, a boy who should have died at 12 but had lived for 164 years, had finally found someone willing to listen to his testimony. That night, as Caroline drove home through the streets of Richmond, past buildings old and new, past the layers of history that made up any American city, she thought about all the stories still waiting to be uncovered, all the voices still waiting to be heard. The work of bearing witness was never done. There would always be more histories to restore, more truths to uncover, more silenced voices demanding to be heard. And she would be there, ready to listen, ready to look closely at what others might overlook, ready to give form and voice to the shadows of the past. Because that was what it meant to be human, to be free, to remember, to honor, and to ensure that no suffering was ever rendered meaningless by being forgotten. The portrait from Richmond, 1861, had finally told its story, and in doing so, it had reminded the world that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, not against death, but against those who would deny others their humanity in the name of conquering it. That was the true horror Daniel Carver had unleashed. And that was the lesson his youngest son had spent 164 years trying to teach anyone who would listen. Someone had finally heard, and the truth, once spoken, could never be completely silenced again.